When The Flash first aired in 2014, it was hailed as one of the best comic book shows on TV, especially by the time the first season had ended. 9 years later, now that the show has aired 184 episodes spanning over the course of 9 seasons, the show is no longer held in high regard, with the most common review from people being that it either started well but then quickly went downhill, or that they just stopped watching around season 4, and there's no denying that the truth is there. What I wanted to do in this video is one final ranking of The Flash's 9 seasons to see if it really did get worse over time and if there was a gradual decline. Now, I do feel like I need to mention how seasons 6 to 9 were split into arcs, so they aren't exactly supposed to be one whole story, especially season 6 and 7, which was split in the middle of an arc due to COVID. I could have ranked all the arcs and compared them to the first 5 seasons, but not only is that not really a fair comparison, but also it doesn't include the interludes, which are these standalone filler episodes in between the arcs that are not actually a part of the arc, so I can't exactly just rank all the arcs. That doesn't include every episode of the series. So while I will be keeping the structures of these seasons in mind and not take away from a season for not having an overarching story, I will not be considering each arc a different placement on the list, so make sure to subscribe, and let's begin starting with the worst season of The Flash. Actually, before we begin, there are some general issues as well as consistently great qualities to this show that are true for every season that I thought I should get out from the start instead of mentioning it every time. For one, Grant Gustin's portrayal of Barry Allen, even if the writing isn't always great for the character, the portrayal itself is always fantastic. Throughout the entirety of the show, even in the bad seasons, he is the quintessential live-action Barry Allen. Furthermore, Blake Neely absolutely never misses in the music department. The music may not always be implemented as well by the editors, but the music itself is always great. On the flip side, Barry is pretty consistently inconsistent as a competent hero or leader throughout the entirety of the show's run, even in the good seasons, and even the good seasons have the occasional bad CGI moments or fight scenes, although it's more prevalent in some seasons than others. With all of that out of the way, let's actually begin with the worst season of The Flash, which is Season 7. The final season is incredibly disappointing, but in my opinion, still not as bad as Season 7. This season is, for one, a bit of a mess structurally speaking, as it begins with the 3 remaining episodes of the previous season's arc, followed immediately by another arc, then an interlude, and ending with a third arc that only gets 4 episodes. Now, I won't be holding the structure of the beginning of the season against it, since that was because of COVID, but even after that, they had 15 episodes left. If you look at the rest of the arc, the fact that only 4 episodes ended up being dedicated to the Godspeed arc, but 3 episodes were dedicated to filler, it just makes no sense. Now, I do like the general idea of the arcs, like I don't mind that idea, but every season was so awfully structured that it ended up being more of a nuisance and more of a detriment than a good thing, and this is definitely on full display in Season 7, alongside basically every other main problem in the Eric Wallace era of the show. The season kept on surprising me with the absolute worst writing the show, or even the Arrowverse as a whole, has ever had, as the characters are given the stupidest, cringiest, and most baffling dialogue ever, like how they refer to the Forces as their children, which is so weird, or Godspeed talking like a Power Rangers villain. The writing was god-awful, which enhanced the season's already Power Rangers-looking aesthetic. Season 7 is still the worst-looking season of the show, whether it be the awful CGI, the terribly shot fight scenes, the cinematography, the choreography, even just people moving around. Season 7 looks absolutely terrible. The arcs themselves are god-awful as well, whether it be the finale to Mirror Monarch's arc, including the cheesiest ending ever, which managed to somehow be worse than the entirety of that arc in Season 6, although actually the penultimate episode to the arc, The Speed of Thought, was kind of better than any episode in Season 7 or 8. Regardless, there's the God Complex arc, which is the weirdest, most poorly conceived, and poorly executed arc on this show ever. Taking inspiration from what is my personal least favorite modern-day Flash comic idea, the Forces are awful, especially in like how I mentioned earlier, how they're portrayed as Barry and Iris's kids. It's just so weird, and the Speed Force is a terrible idea for a villain. The following arc is literally only better because at least there was a decent idea. Godspeed as a main villain, all the speedsters from the show coming together aside from Kid Flash, sure, a great idea, but the execution was so bad because of the show's minuscule budget, the god-awful writing, the main villain's terrible acting, just how short the arc is, and the show's insistence on using the Speed Speedster's worst, least creative, and least speedstery power, the Speed Force constructs, that this fantastic idea for an arc was completely butchered and is arguably the second worst arc on the show, behind only God Complex. The interlude includes one of the lowest rated episodes of the show ever, and also an episode where Cisco leaves. Now, I have thought that Cisco reached a natural conclusion as early as Season 4, and the writers just didn't know what to do with him since, but his departure comes at such an unfortunate time, since he's leaving the show with an awful supporting cast. This is enhanced by the fact that Ralph Dibny was written out at the beginning of the season, and the actor Hartley Sawyer didn't appear in the season at all, which sucks, because not only is he the only remaining supporting character I still really liked, and had a lot of potential for growth, but also, the reasoning for him being written out was a real life, in my opinion, immoral decision. Hartley Sawyer did not deserve to be fired. This leaves the show with the worst supporting cast in the Arrowverse, who are given their own individual episodes, and who just gets worse and worse over time. But even from the beginning of this season, once great characters like Cisco, Joe, and Caitlin were written so poorly, they weren't great either anymore. The only redeeming qualities of this season are Flash's great suit, and one singular fantastic episode, The Speed of Thought, that was supposed to be in Season 6. This season was so poorly conceived and so poorly executed, it might just be the worst season that I have personally seen in the entirety of the Arrowverse. After Season 8 stepped up a bit from Season 7, I had some hope for the final season. The hope partially fell apart with the Keon reveal in Episode 2, hope for the first arc being good was killed by Episode 4, and while Episodes 9 and 10 gave me hope for the ending because they were great, Episode 11 destroyed it as Barry barely appeared in the third to last episode of The Flash. Literally the only reason this season isn't last place is because, well, for one, Season 7 was the worst thing I've ever seen, but also there were 2 episodes in this season that were genuinely fantastic. However, while these episodes do help boost the average of the season more than they typically would because of the short amount of episodes this season had, unfortunately, the short amount of episodes also came at a huge detriment to the arcs themselves. Alongside the Eric Wallace era's signature awful dialogue, mostly bad cinematography, and bad fight scenes, this season was just incredibly poorly thought out. The first arc is given the amount of episodes it needed, with 5, but with just 8 episodes left afterwards, dedicating 4 of them to filler before a story arc where we watch the final main villain's origin story was such a stupid idea that not only worsened the individual episodes, because filler sucks usually, not only hurt the final arc, but it also ruins Cobalt Blue as a villain, and after Red Death was as awful as she was, the season really needed a good villain. Just a terrible, terrible decision. It also sucks that 2 of these filler episodes didn't even focus on Barry, and there were 3 episodes in a row where Barry just either didn't appear or didn't appear as the Flash. We didn't see the Flash on screen for 3 episodes in a row. In the final season, it's genuinely unforgivable. Instead, we focus on this supporting cast who are worse than ever, with Chester and Allegra being completely defined by their relationship, which nobody cares about, this original character named Keon who hijacks Caitlin's body for a year, allowing everyone to think that she had died, although nobody seems to care. Chilblain literally doesn't do anything, and of course Cecile is the single worst character on this show ever, as she gains a new power every episode and eventually becomes a different hero named Virtue. As a 75-year-old woman in 2049, this show has become a joke. Additionally, Cecile is a part of another problem with the season, as her constant empathic ability is used to talk down to the audience as if they can't understand the nuances of human emotion, which is similar to the constant flashbacks making up around 5% of this season. Since the audiences are too stupid to remember anything, it's infuriating. Season 9 brings the show to a close on a whimper, as it ends with some of the worst stories they've ever produced, all while Barry is just casually running around in the greatest Flash suit ever created that is completely wasted on this season, although it does appear in one other season. The Cecile problem I just talked about is at its worst in Season 8, where they hold nothing back, but they're constantly telling us exactly what every character is feeling, becoming increasingly frustrating every time. Thankfully, the season does have some great ideas and some decent execution of some of those ideas to make up for the back half of this show's pretty consistent bad writing and bad looking action scenes. This season manages to do actually some things well. Armageddon was a decently well thought out first arc with two good main villains in Death Sparrow and Reverse Flash, even if this arc being marketed as a crossover led to this arc feeling underwhelming as well. The team-ups with Atom and maybe Black Lightning were cool. The rest of the lineup of this crossover superheroes, including Alex Danvers, Ryan Wilder, and Mia Smoke, basically only original characters, yet not very exciting. Still, the Reverse Flashpoint plot was fun, Despero was a nice twist on the character, and Flash finally getting the gold boots perfected an already great Flash costume. And then, surprisingly, while the following filler episodes weren't very exciting, the following arc was still better than any of the arcs from the previous two seasons discussed. While an arc focusing on Frost can only be so good, Deathstorm is a great-looking and scary villain, whose emotional connection to Caitlin using Ronnie's body was rather effective. Frost and the rest of the supporting cast are still pretty awful though, as her romantic storyline with Chillblaine, who's a murderer, was disturbing, while Chester and Allegra remain irrelevant, and Cecile, well, let's not rehash that one. Finally, the season did not hit the landing, as the Deathstorm arc is followed by a few filler episodes and one final 4-episode long arc, which was pretty bad. Why do they keep on ending these seasons on these 4-episode long arcs? They brought back Matt Letcher finally, only to waste him on this amnesiac good guy Thawne, while Tom Cavanagh is brought back yet again for no reason, in an arc which brings back some forces to be the main villains, giving us Thawne's worst appearance ever as well. Season 8 might look good because it's sandwiched between two god-awful seasons, but compared to every other season, it's not a good one. Season 8 is a season chock full of some great and ambitious ideas. Some of them are well executed, some of them are not, but also the season has poorly executed bad ideas as well. Being the only season where I wouldn't give even one episode a 9 out of 10, and certainly not a 10 out of 10, Season 8 is pretty mediocre. Starting the Eric Wallace era of the show rather well, Season 6's first arc was not just good by the standards we now know Eric Wallace has, but it was an 8-episode long breath of fresh air after a few seasons I definitely wouldn't call great. I wouldn't call any of them bad necessarily, but this first arc of Season 6 was better than basically Seasons 3, 4, and 5. Bloodwork was a surprisingly well-written, well-acted, and well-developed villain, with a good rivalry with Barry, who's brilliantly woven into this arc's other priority, which is to set up the Crisis, which it does a lot better than almost any of the other Arrowverse Crisis setup seasons. Nothing touches Arrow though. Flash is an easy second place. The arc does introduce Chester and Allegra, but I wouldn't say that they were bad characters at that point, nor did they really take up much focus, as admittedly the days where the show had a decent supporting cast were then coming to an end, but they still hadn't. Cisco isn't at his peak, but he's still a far better character than any of the new generation supporting characters. Frost is given a nicely handled connection and borderline rivalry with Bloodwork. Elongated Man is given some fun moments with Sue Dearborn, and Iris is being handled rather well, as the looming crisis, where her husband will die and she'll write the article, lays a heavy burden on her shoulders. I recall back when the Flash fans were rejoicing as Eric Wallace was breathing new life into this show with Season 6. Yeah, the second the Crisis came and went, Eric Wallace seemed to tap out, as no other arc or villain even comes close to the quality of the first one. It seems to me that maybe it was a leftover idea for the Crisis setup from Todd Helbing. Notice how I mentioned after the Crisis, not after Season 6, as everything after the Crisis, which is most of the season, around 2/3, contains this relatively unfocused, very unmemorable, and genuinely boring arc, with a worsening supporting cast, with its larger focus on Allegra and Chester, a now irrelevant Nash Wells, who before was relevant as he was Pariah. That was cool. After the Crisis, he's irrelevant, and then a poorly adapted, dull main villain. Season 6 is not awful, not even the second arc was clue enough to the road the show will soon go down in Season 6 and then in 9. If this season continued the quality of the first arc, it had the potential to be higher on the list. As it stands, the rest of the season break it down to being the best Eric Wallace era season, but still genuinely worse than any of the Todd Helbing era seasons. Season 4 comes from a point on the show where we expected more, so people were disappointed. I personally always enjoyed, appreciated, and even defended this season, but looking back, it's probably the worst of the Todd Helbing era of this show, due to a few factors. DeVoe is a great villain, but only for 2/3 of the season's run whenever he's played by Neil Sandilands. He's well written and well developed throughout the season, but it's only when he's played by Neil Sandilands in episodes 1 to 9 and episodes 18 to 23 that he actually feels like like the same person and has a good rivalry with Barry. The body switching plot was a bad idea. This does, however, leave most of the season with a good villain. There is one third, however, which is right in the middle. That's not good, where it doesn't. His plan becomes a double-edged sword, as it does force what would be villains of the week into being relevant to the plot, but it also gives the writers an excuse to overuse villains of the week, and that leaves the season with a lot of filler-feeling episodes that aren't technically filler. However, one actually filler episode is legitimately the best episode of the entire show. Enter Flash Time. It contributes less to the overall story of the season, but does make the season more memorable in general, as it's literally the best episode of the entire show, with the best visuals, the best music, and the best use of Flash's powers in the history of the series, helped by the season's incredible looking Flash suit, which is one thing that is always good about the season. It's probably the best looking season of The Flash. The supporting cast this season is definitely not at this show's peak or anything. It's beginning to show the cracks. Cisco doesn't really feel as relevant as before. Wally left, Harry Wells is brought back just to be ruined, and both Iris and Frost are given the wrong roles. Iris should have never been involved in Team Flash, let alone their leader, and I hate what they did with Killer Frost by turning her into a hero and a split personality from Caitlin. That being said, the season did have Ralph Dibny. In fact, it introduced Ralph Dibny, who quickly became my favorite supporting character on this show. His introduction episode is fantastic. He's this complex, well-written, well-acted, and very fun superhero who becomes also the emotional core of the season. They absolutely nailed the elongated man in season 4. So yeah, in comparison to seasons 7, 8, and 9 of the show, the supporting cast is incredible. In comparison to seasons 1 and 2 of the show, the supporting cast is not great. Season 4 has some high highs, but also some relatively low lows. It's maybe the most inconsistent season throughout, but in my opinion remains much more good than bad. It is the worst of the Todd Helbing era because there are a good amount of lower than average episodes, but the good episodes are pretty consistently better than the good episodes of the next season on this list. The next season just so happens to be a bit more consistent, but it was very close between seasons 4 and 5 for the placement on this list. Season 5 is severely held back by a number of factors, including an awful Flash suit that is, in the middle of the season, turned into a bad Flash suit, still bad though, and that is a contributing factor to Season 5 looking significantly worse visually than Season 4. There's also a main villain who starts threatening and effective, but then his weakness is found and just becomes a recurring punching bag, whose constant escapes became a meme, and then he's replaced by a different Cicada who was themselves replaced by Thawne. Thawne, however, is a saving grace for the villain side of the season, as his story is far more personal to Barry, more relevant to Nora, and consistently brings out the biggest emotional stakes of the season, which the season has. The supporting cast kind of mirrors the episodic situation of Season 4 in comparison to Season 5. It doesn't have the highs of Ralph Dibny in Season 4, but it doesn't have the lows of Iris West of Season 4 either. It's a little bit more consistently average. Cisco's metahuman cure arc is frustrating, Caitlin's Frost story remains a mistake, but does have redeeming qualities in her revealed backstory. Sherlock Wells is a good character, but feels like an unnecessary excuse to keep Tom Cavanagh around, while stealing a detective story that should have gone to Ralph, who ends up not really getting enough to do in the season. Nora can be annoying, that is a common complaint, but I would defend that. I would say that she's more often than not effectively used as the emotional core of the season. If Joe and Iris did anything this season, it wasn't memorable enough for me to recall. So I gotta be honest, I definitely do not connect to Season 5's plot nearly as much as Season 4, nor do I think the season hits the highs of that season, and along the simple fact that Flash looks terrible, I was struggling with the placements of these two seasons, because while Season 7 isn't as memorable or visually pleasing, it is ironically more consistent despite the switching main villains, as there aren't any really bad episodes, which makes the average of the season a bit higher than Season 4. Despite this, not only did I still consider putting Season 4 higher, but while writing this, I kind of decided that, considering they have the same score anyway, I'm just deciding that Season 4 and 5 are actually tied on this list, because while Season 5 is more consistent, it doesn't reach the highs of Season 4, so they're kind of just the same quality-wise. Season 5 doesn't manage to keep its main villain consistently interesting, but the writing, fight scenes, and general episode quality is largely consistent. Season 5 and 4 are tied on this list for 4th and 5th place. Season 3 is often where people say that the show started to go downhill, and sure, the season isn't as good as the next two placements on this list. The show is definitely still good at this point. It didn't start off well, as the hyped up Flashpoint was very disappointingly executed, leading into this relatively boring first few Villain of the Week episodes where the post-Flashpoint consequences just didn't feel substantial enough. The season began to hit its stride, however, with the back-to-back introductions of Savitar in episode 6 and Killer Frost in episode 7. I would say this was Caitlin's, and definitely Killer Frost's, best and most interesting season, as she's allowed to fully succumb to her Killer Frost dark side, which was not portrayed as a separate persona. She's such a well-executed villain because of the 2 seasons of personal connection to Team Flash. She honestly could have been a main villain, and it would have worked had they gone down that route. The rest of the supporting cast, aside from maybe HR, is pretty great. I just think that he's an unnecessary addition to the show, and they should have retired the character of Harrison Wells. He kind of makes the Welleses feel interchangeable and unimportant, especially since he doesn't really add anything to the team. However, Wally, like Caitlin, is definitely at his peak here, as Season 3 is the only season where he appears throughout, and definitely the only season where he appears a lot as Kid Flash. The season has a fantastic main villain in Savitar with an incredible design, great threat factor, great rivalry with Barry, and a well-handled, slow-burn intrigue story arc surrounding his identity, alongside some great rioting, fight scenes, and cinematography. Season 3 is a season that started off relatively weak, but got better and better over time, even if the finale didn't really stick the landing, and I think deserves to be credited as one of the great seasons of The Flash. For the most part, Season 2 doesn't actually have any consistent issues outside of the norms I mentioned at the beginning of the season, as while sure Barry can be inconsistent and sure the CGI can be bad, the season doesn't really have any other problems. Getting the obvious out of the way, Zoom is a top tier ideal main villain, being scarier than any other with a fantastic rivalry with Barry, and is a part of the single best villain twist of the show, as the whole Jay Garrick Zoom twist was an absolute stroke of genius, as the season also introduces the multiverse in a super fun and interesting way. The supporting cast are absolutely incredible in Season 2. Cisco is as hilarious as he was in Season 1, and his superheroic origins are on full display. Caitlin and Joe are handled maybe only mildly worse than Season 1. Harry Wells is peak Wells, and Iris is arguably handled better as a love interest than before. So with this incredible and really scary villain, as well as a great season-long storyline, a great twist, a great supporting cast, and Barry is kind of at his peak here as well, complete with the introduction of the multiverse in a way that makes it feel a lot more, wonderful than it would later. The Flash Season 2 was an exceptional follow-up to the first season, to the point where I definitely would not disagree if the season was your favorite. I just think Season 1 is mildly better. Like Season 2, Season 1 has 0 consistent issues outside of the norm, but even then, one of them is arguably excusable. Barry being inconsistent is far less of an issue here, as he isn't experienced, and does for the most part feel more experienced throughout the runtime of the season. Season 1 has an incredible main villain with the best and most personal hero-villain rivalry ever, with a fantastically well thought out and executed season-long storyline with peak intrigue and built-up mystery, and a peak supporting cast. Season 1 is also where the show peaked in the wonder of the speedster powers, as we are exposed to the new uses of these abilities through the lens of Barry Allen, which is used more creatively and more effectively and consistently throughout the season than any other. Season 1 is clearly the most well thought out season, with the most care put into it, into the writing, the ideas, and the general concept of the show. So yeah, with the ranking from best to worst being 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4 and 5 are tied, and then 6, then 8, 9, 7, the show didn't necessarily get worse and worse every season per se, but the quality of the show definitely went down over the years, with the only real exception being that Season 8 was better than Season 7. It is very unfortunate, as the show started so great and mostly kept its quality consistent enough throughout the Todd Helbing era, but Eric Wallace was only able to keep up that quality for maybe 7 episodes, as everything after the Crisis feels like a completely different show with less effort and far less quality put into it. Hopefully, maybe we'll be able to remember this show fondly, as the beginnings are truly fantastic.